David, so excited to continue this conversation with you. So just for anybody who jumped into the conversation in the middle, there is a first half to this. It's been posted over on Wes Roth's main YouTube channel. There we got into post-labor economics and what the world is going to look like as it plays out over the next 10 to 15 years in much more detail. We're going to continue that conversation and go a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about simulation theory. We're going to talk about brain-computer interfaces. And we're going to tackle one of the biggest questions of all time, consciousness. Let's do it.
So what do you think about consciousness? First of all, is it something that we can define? Is it on a spectrum, or is it either like binary on or off? And like you were talking about retrocausality, is consciousness, like the double slit experiment, et cetera, like the universe not rendering until the last possible moment? Do you believe it's possible that consciousness, kind of collapses that quantum state, or whatever happens? Does that play a role in it?
Yeah. So this is basically a fundamental, like, what's my cosmological model? So the answer to that is the best. There's kind of two metaphors that I use to describe this. So one is, think of reality as a book. All the pages are written, and since time is more and more evidence is growing that time is illusory, like it's basically a construct that only exists in our head. So if the substrate of our ontological container is like a book, I'm not saying it is a book, maybe it is, but it's like a book in that, time for us is just the flipping of a page, right? But the next chapter is already written. The beginning is written, the end is written. But what's happening is that the resolution is getting better over time. So it's like the book is being edited. So it's like, oh, well, now my characters have gone and looked at this thing. So as the writer, I have to figure out what's actually there, right? So that's one model. Another model is the Ouroboros model, which is that within an ontological container, you have ontological strata. So an ontological strategy is layers of what exists, right? So at some point you have, you've got, as far as we can tell, there's, subatomic particles and maybe there's quantum foam or something below that we can't really tell yet. Maybe it's strings. So that's like a boundary state of our ontological container. And maybe that's just like, we actually can't detect the primitives of reality. Like, it's just like, okay, you're seeing the first thing above that, which is subatomic particles and energy waves, but we're actually not able to access the primitives below that, which is what I call primordial substrate. There might be several layers below that. And so then at the higher level, the highest order things that we can perceive are our own consciousness and the concept of civilization and those sorts of things. But there also might be ontological strata above that. Like, is the galaxy itself conscious in some sort of way? Or is it aware? But then, of course, like in the same way that we can't really detect or interact with anything below subatomic particles and fundamental energies, maybe there's things above that we're also not able to interact with.
That's interesting to think about. Sorry, go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. So if that's true, then maybe there's a sliding scale, like it's all a fractal. So you can go further up the ontological strata and further down the ontological strata. That's, of course, extrapolating. It's entirely possible that what you see is what you get, right? Maybe there is nothing else, and it's just like the universe is expanding and it's going to eventually fizzle out. Seems a little absurd to me, but then again, it's reality. I hope. But then the idea though is, once you go far enough down, it almost seems like consciousness might be the substrate, but then consciousness is also pretty high up the ontological strata. So at some point, it almost seems like a loop.
Top and bottom?
So, yeah. So it's like oh crap, what's the thing where you take like a strip of paper, a Mobius
strip.
Mobius strip. So reality might be like a Mobius strip. Like when if you ignore time for a second, you say, okay, what is the beingness of reality? And it's like, just to give you some perspective of where I got this intuition, when I was at the peak experience of ayahuasca, I envisioned myself in reality as a chalkboard and a teacher, and I tried to look behind the chalkboard, and it was just me. So it's like, there is no difference. It's the same up and down. And so it's like, well, okay, I can accept that. So maybe consciousness is both emergent and substrate, is kind of the long story short, I guess.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's a big concept to sort of understand, to grok, if you will. But yeah, that's That's very, very interesting. And the fact that a lot of the AI stuff seems to be like we're going to be getting more into simulations and maybe even understanding consciousness. It's like I feel like we're slowly gonna we're pulling at this little string, and we might unravel it to where eventually we're going to find out more about how how the whole universe works. And some people listening might be like, "Oh, you guys are just crazy, whatever." But no, a lot of people. I mean, Demis is talking about it. Andre Karpathy is saying that maybe one of the reasons that we're here in this universe is to build a superintelligence, and that superintelligence will be able to unlock the puzzle of the universe. And if there's a creator, those are like his words, if there's something that created it, that created this universe, with the assistance of a superintelligence, we might be able to like signal up like, hey, we're alive, we're here, we're sort of like win the game. We're ready. We're ready to come out. It's like the win condition.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, man, it's crazy to think about, but I mean, who knows? Nobody knows at the end of the day, but certainly, that's interesting to think about.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you take the story, like if the reality is a story, then, we're like, I don't know, maybe at the midpoint, if we're lucky, we might be at the very beginning. Have you heard of it's one of the answers to the Fermi paradox, like universal firstborn? Like the universe is actually still really hot right now, and it's only been cool enough, just long enough for life to have started. So it almost seems like Earth might be one of the first habitable planets that the universe might have even created. Because it's like, okay, well, you look at how old the universe is, was 13 billion years. But it's going to last in its current state more or less for like 100 trillion years. So it's like, wow, we're the first kids on the block. So we got to figure it all out from scratch. To me, I think that's one of the most compelling answers. Just when you look at the numbers, it's like the universe is like 0.008% of the way through its lifespan. We're pretty early.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
I kind of like that.
The primary argument for why it's hard to believe that is because if you were to wake up as a conscious being and there's like trillion years of existence, wouldn't it make more sense that we'd be somewhere else on the bell curve except the farthest extreme left possible? So I don't know. Like it feels really early on, but that's the only thing that I wonder about is like what are the odds that we're the only ones that look at an empty universe?
Right. I mean, there you can depend on how you run the math and what priors you assume are true. You can say yes, it would be astronomically uncommon for us to wake up at this time, unless when you look at non-locality and retrocausality and those sorts of things, you say, well, maybe what the universe was trying to achieve in its uncollapsed state, in its vast search space basically, was it was trying to create consciousness, and it created consciousness as quickly as it could. And so then the entire superposition of the entire universe collapsed around our existence. Now, I've run these ideas by some of the AIs and said, no, it doesn't work that way because the collapse only happens at light speed and those sorts of things. And I'm like, okay, whatever. But I think that that's still a viable explanation, is that we have locally collapsed the universe around our existence because the universe wanted to generate an observer as quickly as possible, or wanted to, or happened to, in the superposition search space. And so then the light cone expanding out from us is settled, is collapsed.
Yeah, well, certainly if there's
I don't know if that's true.
Well, yeah, but if there's intentionality behind the simulation, that could explain why I don't think of it as like a random bell curve. So
no, that's a fair point. And you could say that it's I think Elon Musk's model is that it's more of a recursive simulation, that maybe we're just running in like one simulation that's another simulation, and it's just there's a civilization or a species, one simulation level above us that's trying to reverse engineer how the Big Bang happened. And so it's like, cool. We don't know what they're trying to figure out. Like I said, curiosity and entertainment are the two primary reasons to run simulations.
Yeah. I mean, it does make sense what you're saying about everything kind of collapsing around the first consciousness, because it's like similar to how the universe waits till the last moment to render something, right? Similar how do we render games? Like if you ever go too fast in a game, you see things popping up into existence. That's because they're not rendered until you see them. So that from that perspective, it makes sense. Like we are the first consciousness or intelligence or whatever. And so the rest of the game world is like, okay, we don't have to render all this other stuff where it was supposed to emerge and kind of percolate. Nope, we got it here, collapse everything else and focus on this. I don't know. That kind of makes sense. That makes sense.
How are you feeling about brain-computer interfaces nowadays? Are you kind of seeing what's happening with Neuralink and the other companies and thinking that in the next 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to be plugging into anything that augments your internal thinking?
I will be, I'm usually, somewhat paradoxically, I'm usually a late adopter of new technology. I'm kind of at my grumpy curmudgeon phase where I'm like, all these newfangled whiz bang gadgets, whatever, I don't care. I mean, I'll be a late stage adopter just by virtue of my disposition, my temperament. But I am still personally very, very skeptical of BCI for a number of reasons. Number one, people say, oh, we're going to have nanotechnology. It's like, we already have nanotechnology. You are made of nanotechnology. Like your body's storage system, you store 3 billion base pairs in every single cell of your body. And it's at the atomic scale. You literally cannot store a bit of information smaller than DNA that we know of, right? So it's like, we're already nanotech. To think that we can do better than that in any sort of reasonable time frame, I mean, that's the epitome of hubris. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm just saying, like, wow, that's a really big engineering challenge. So I'm skeptical that it's going to be meaningful beyond prosthesis, or a maybe a slightly higher bandwidth kind of input-output device. But in terms of like some of the loftier things that people hope it'll do, I think that, like, full dive VR where you jack into the back of your head, I don't know that that's possible, let alone desirable. So I might be a primitivist or a natalist or whatever what they're called, like,
Yeah.
with some genetic engineering and other things. I think I'll be fine in this form factor. Now, that being said, I don't think that we're going to be human forever. I do think that there's going to be a period of transhumanism and then a period of posthumanism, on a long enough timeline. But 10 to 15 years, no, that's too fast.
Okay, but is there any way we can keep up with AI then, that you're thinking of, maybe with full dive or something else? Because
Yeah.
don't we need to think 100 or 1,000 times faster to kind of stay relevant soon?
Well, so one thing that everyone has to accept is that we were always all irrelevant anyways. That's one of the, I would add that as like a fifth noble truth. It's like Buddha said that you didn't matter in the first place. Get over it. But I think it's a false game to try and keep up with AI, because it's like, do you try and keep up with a tractor? Do you try and keep up with a telescope? Like, telescopes and microscopes can see better than you. Do you care? You just use a telescope and microscope. The tractor is infinitely stronger than you, so you pilot the tractor, right? Likewise, I think that AI, yes, it can think faster than us in some respects. It can certainly do more. Like, I've been able to do many years worth of research in just the month or two that I've had deep research. But at the same time, I can take in that information as fast as it can give it to me, and then it updates my own mental models. I'm still the bottleneck, right? But at the same time, I haven't found an upper ceiling to the thing that I can understand and learn. So yeah, is the pace off? Sure. But you know what? Compared to the rest of humanity, I'm already slow, right? Like, I'll never catch up with Andrei Karpathy and Ilya Sutskever on the things that they know about. But at the same time, I've managed to become a world leader on post-labor economics. Just because when you start to look at the total epistemology of humanity, the search space is so mind-numbingly, stupidly huge that all right, so just on the topic of novels, because I'm a writer, no amount of computation will ever be able to write every novel that is possible to write. You will literally run out of atoms and energy in the universe trying to write every novel that we can write.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't care how fast the AI is. I don't care how much there is. There's still going to be a novel that I want to write that the AIs would never have written on its own. And that's just novels. That's not everything else going on. So it's like, from a mathematical perspective, the number of possible things that you can do and commit to and understand is just, I mean, it's huge. And when you look at, okay, well, what's the value add that humans have? There's a few things that we add to this equation. Number one is desire, right? So there's a thing that you want to do. So there's desire or passion or whatever kind of impulse or imperative that we have. But then there's another thing, and that is human search heuristics. And so our ability to say, no, that doesn't quite feel right, let's go in a different direction, because we actually evolved to operate in very, very high dimensional, highly uncertain environments. That's most of our existence is like, I don't, you get in a car, you don't know if there's going to be someone coming at you at 80 miles an hour in a head-on collision. You know that you can adapt to that as you go. That is a superpower that humans have. And that ability to improvise and that ability to have search heuristics to find what you're trying to get to, I think is actually going to set us apart. Maybe not indefinitely, because from a first principles perspective, I mean, unless we have some sort of like really weird quantum mechanics computing going on in our head, there's nothing that we're doing that can't be approximated by AI. But at least for the foreseeable future, like, I can use my intuition in conjunction with AI and figure out new stuff really fast that the AI would just be spinning its wheels on its own.
So I guess one thing that I'm struggling to kind of project and model is, I mean, let's say we get to the point where we have somewhat of a post scarcity, we have automation, we have, to the point where even the poorest individuals, let's say they have 100 times the amount of money than they need to get their basic necessities paid for, right? And then, so somebody that makes more money has 1,000 times their minimum, and a billionaire has, 10 billion times their minimum.
Right.
What power in that situation do you have if you have $1 billion? Like, who are you going to influence? Because I mean, what's the motivation to go from 100 times your necessity to 1,000 times your necessity? It seems like now people chase it for power because that means something, right? Like I can push
Right.
people around, I can kind of impose my will. Does that stay in that future, or is that greatly diminished?
I tend to look at this in a few different ways. So number one is just like raw physics and thermodynamics, right? Like already today, everyone on this call, we technically have control over far more energy and materials and resources than we need by a long shot, right? And just by being able to pay for electricity and internet connections and everything else that we do, 4K web cameras, those sorts of things. We already have a tremendous amount of abundance. It just becomes transparent to you. So that's normalcy bias. The longer you live with something, the more you get used to it. Air conditioning is another thing. It's funny. Someone was telling me a story of they moved to North Carolina, where I'm at, after moving from, I think, somewhere in Northern Europe. And they're like, oh, you weird Americans and your air conditioning. And it's like, yeah, just wait till summer comes around. And they're like, how do you survive here without air conditioning?
Right.
It's like, you don't. We're subtropical. And we're like, look at the color of our skin. We're not engineered for this environment, this biome. So we're always on, and it's not always linear. My wife will point out, because she's a historian. So it's not always a linear progression of technological expansion, but in the grand arc of history, it's generally linear with a few setbacks here and there. So that's one way to look at it, is just the linear progression of technology. You get more and more power over time. Your dollar goes farther in many respects. Of course, there's inflation, but whatever. Technology is empowering. And so then the other thing that you can look at is, all right, well, that's the technological reality, but then what about the biological reality? What is it that humans actually want? And so there's a few frameworks that I use to look at economic agency and the impact of technology to understand this. So one is SDT, so that's self-determination theory, which says that people have 3 primary psychological needs. So that is relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And so SDT is one way of just saying, okay, all else being equal, what are the drives, the baseline psychological drives that people want other than their physical needs being met? Because again, we're talking hypothetically, your physical needs are met 1,000 times over, so what's left? Another one is Glasser's choice theory, which I think it's a framework with, I think, 6 points. So it's like status, competence, or status, mastery, fun, those kinds of things. So there's several of these frameworks that are way more useful to understand these things than Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which a lot of people default to. So you look at those and you say, okay, well, what is it that people are really going to keep working towards, even if all else is being met? And so to study that, we've looked through all of history, because every society has had an aristocracy or a ruling class, or a capitalist or oligarchs or whatever. And so going back to ancient Athens, the golden age of Athens, about 10% of the citizens were, landowning, wealthy men. And what did they do? They went to the Eleusinian Mysteries to trip balls, and then they debated politics and everything else. And they wrote plays, and they had symposia and those sorts of things. The Romans were not much different. They basically did the same thing, except they also conquered Gaul because they were bored. So there's lots and lots of ways that people entertain themselves. But consider that some of the greatest minds throughout history, at least Western history, and I guess to a greater and lesser degree, although the social structures in like ancient Japan and ancient China are a little bit different, but still there's always been like affluent thinkers and doers that moved the needle of history. So whether it was Charles Darwin, right? He had a wealthy family. Isaac Newton, same thing. Many people throughout history. A lot of people, when they have that kind of cognitive bandwidth available, they do useful things with it. Some people do less useful things. Some people just entertain themselves and chase views, or like if you ever watch Bridgerton, right? A lot of people with nothing better to do just compete with each other because we're apes. Like, we're fundamentally social creatures. So we compete with each other on, popularity contests and those sorts of things. Like, I mean, even today we put numbers on it, right? It's like, who has the most followers, right? It's three YouTubers, right? We're all at least unconsciously aware of like relative social standing, right? So there's lots and lots and lots to do in terms of what people will pursue, whether once their basic needs are met. And again, to a greater or lesser degree, most of it is benign. Some people accumulate power just to accumulate power because they think it'll do something for them. But really, there's a book called The Status Game by Will Storr, which I tell everyone to read it because it explains so much of human behavior. When power and when money and power are satisfied, status is the next thing that people go for. So when you look at like Jeff Bezos, who's like, I'm going to build spaceships, right? It's because that's the next high status thing. He's not expecting to get any money or power from it. But it's like, if he can compete with Elon to make another space company, then he's as high status, right? So like that status game really explains what a lot of people do once they're at the top. Like, it's like, you got status, you want more status, right? That's what everyone wants.
Absolutely. So the four things that you kind of mentioned that people do. So in the past, this was only available to wealthy individuals, wealthy families, people who are at the top. But I mean, you have fun, right? Just entertainment. You have games / competition, right? Tennis or video games or poker or like you name it, right? And there's like thinking, philosophers, stuff like that. And also power / social standing, kind of climbing that social ladder. So you think that in the future, once we get to kind of a post scarcity future, this is kind of where most people kind of fall into those categories, more or less, right?
Yeah, and what I'll add to that is yes, when you look at a decadent society or a decadent rung of society, usually those are the things that they're pursuing, right? They're pursuing hunting for leisure, they're writing poetry for leisure, they're trying to one up each other, those sorts of things. And a lot of people look at that and say that is clearly a decaying society, and there's actually a lot of merit, whether it is like religious merit or moral merit or ethical merit, in the striving that most people are supposed to toil. And of course, there's all the stories of like venture capitalists and founders that once they exit and they have a lot of money, some of them become a lot more miserable, like the phenomenon of not millionaires, but people who won the lottery and become really miserable. And it's because the pattern of life that we have does not really suit, a lot of people, once you have the problem of choice, you don't really know what to do with your time. And I've gone through that partially by transitioning from a conventional career to a completely self-directed career. Obviously, I don't have nearly the resources that those people do, but it's like, I can do anything that I want to do with my time. And, as long as I'm making enough money. And that's actually one of the reasons that I've struggled with burnout, is because like I can do everything. And when the menu of things that you can do is infinitely long or feels infinitely long, you never run out of time. You run out of energy and health first. So, but yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, there's definitely, there's a few things that people will trend towards. And then you can make more moral judgments as to whether or not that's a good thing for people or a good thing for society. What I'm here to say is like there are challenges. Whatever choice you choose, there are challenges to it.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. And I feel like it just brings up more questions because I mean, I think you're 100% right. In 2016, I launched my e-commerce business. And at some point, I hit a peak. I remember I reached the goal that I set for myself that I wrote down. I made more in 1 month than I made working a job for a year prior to that. And, had you asked me any point in my life before that, like, how would you feel in that month? I'd be like, oh, I would be ecstatic, over the
Right.
moon. I had like just danced and like, I don't know, I was miserable. I was like borderline depressed.
Yep.
It was, it was such a weird experience. And I think a lot of people will have to, I mean, you hear Jim Carrey talk about it. He's like, people think that money and fame is the answer. And he says, I did that. It's not the answer. And I wish
Right.
people achieve that as soon as possible so they realize it's not the answer. So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever talked about this, but is there anything, I mean, is that something that we have to think about once we get there? Like once people have everything and are miserable, or do we have some idea of how to help with that?
Yeah. Oh, I've got plenty of ideas on how to help with that. I think that here's how I think it might play out is many people will get to that. A lot of people are just going to be perfectly content, just, fooling
Yeah.
around, right? A lot like you mean I can just have a barbecue every week and, play with the kids? Many people will be perfectly content, right? Just playing with their kids, playing with their dogs, hanging out with their friends, watching football. And I really envy those people. My brain can't tolerate that
Mhm.
lifestyle though.
Yeah.
Now for everyone else who gets to that point and realizes like, hey, there's kind of a crisis to this. You can either start something or join something. It's kind of the way that I think about it. And so by starting something, that's what I'm doing with post-labor economics. I don't actually have any economical imperative to study post-labor economics. But with the platform that I've got from my YouTube and all the other communities that I run and everything, it's like, this is the most meaningful thing that I can do for society right now. So, the little social monkey brain kicks on and it's like, high status, cool. I can get higher status by working on post-labor economics. So cool. It's like, there's a, what's the word? Not eudaimonic. I guess eudaimonia is maybe the right word, but there's a pro-social kind of impulse, right? Because you can get high social status by being mean and evil, but you can get even higher status by doing something constructive, right? So I'm starting something, I'm creating something, and then on the other side, you can join something, right? You can join, like a spin class, or you can join, some whatever other movement you want to join to find a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of mastery and connection, and those sorts of things. And I think everyone's going to have to go through that, but even more because and what I'm talking about there is like basically what do you replace work with, right? Because
Right.
you can divide between like what is a job, what is work, what is labor, what is an occupation. They all mean roughly the same thing, but when you really look closely, they don't mean exactly the same thing. So like everyone's going to have work to do, but it might be, in my case, a lot of it is voluntary, and a lot of it is based on what's the biggest positive impact that I can have on humanity, and whether you're starting something or joining something. But then, what people will realize is that if you're working because you're running from something, whether it is something from your childhood, like you had bad parents, or you're really poor when you're growing up, or whatever, no amount of work will backfill that pain. And you're going to continue having the same problems. This is something that I tell my wife because she's a bit younger than me. But like every time she moves from one job to another, I'm like, all the problems that you had at your current job are going to follow you, right? Until you learn to work with people differently or overcome this problem, like, basically establishing better boundaries or communicating your work to people better. I was like, it's all going to follow you. And the same thing is true once you're free from labor. A lot of people imagine they're like, okay, I'm going to be liberated from labor. It's like all your anxiety, all your depression, all your relationship issues, none of them is predicated on your career. So you're still going to have to face that. And in fact, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting because there maybe jobs in some ways are actually keeping us from the kind of skills of teamwork and listening that we've always needed, because you can sort of go somewhere and they tell you what to do and you can make money. But if you were raising a child today and they're going to enter the job, what would be the job force in 2040, they need the skill of listening. They need the skill of teamwork. They need the skill, I guess, of influence, all sorts of things that are different from like what we train for.
Yeah. Fundamentally different skill set, just in the same way that being like an influencer, like like nothing that they teach you in school is relevant to this occupation. What I will say is that a lot of the stuff that I learned in my ordinary career did translate. Like I got really good at running meetings, right? And that's how I record. It's like, okay, there's a whole bunch of information that I need to communicate out to people. Let me just do it the same way. Just as one example. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Is that and we've gone through this several times. Like, so when you look at parenting styles, there's like, what is it? There's authoritative parenting, authoritarian parenting, and then permissive parenting. I think those are the three main models.
Whether or not you explain or not, I forget what they call it.
So authoritarian parenting is like the really severe, like drill instructor, which is like, you're going to do what I say, no questions asked, children should be seen, not heard. And that might sound like a really draconian way of raising children, but in a previous age when like, if a child wandered off, like they fell in the river and drowned, or they got bitten by a snake and died, or they fell down the well, like that was actually like, there's actually a biological reason that is almost the default parenting style, is because the world, until you have the nice, safe, basically bubble wrapped world that we live in today, the world is really dangerous, particularly for human children. We're very fragile. And so you have that parenting style made sense, agrarian and for hunter-gatherers. It's like when you're safe, yeah, you can, mess around. But if you do something wrong, like your dad's going to like beat the crap out of you so that you remember, don't do that thing again, even if you have no idea why. Because that's another way that humans learn, is like, okay, I go over to the well, I get, hurt. I don't understand why, but then once you're older, you get it and you're like, you do the same thing, right? And then authoritative parenting is the more popular, well, I guess permissive parenting is more popular right now because a lot of people our age had very authoritarian parents. I had the opposite problem. My parents were extremely permissive because they had like controlling parents, and so they did the opposite for me. So I was a free-range child, basically. So I had the problem of choice earlier, which is like, okay, my parents aren't giving me any direction and it's safe. What do I do with my time? So like, I build stuff in the basement, and my cousin and I built a whole lot of bottle rockets and pipe bombs and that sort of thing. We never destroyed anything on accident. We were just out in the woods blowing stuff up like kids do if you let them. Learned a lot and that sort of thing. But to tie it back to, AI and post-scarcity lifestyles is the people that have learned, like, probably everyone our generation has heard, like, just go to school and get a better job, right? Just get a degree, get an education. That has already broken down, right? Getting an education is no guarantee of being able to take care of yourself. So then we have to renegotiate, like, what are all the other patterns, lifestyle patterns that we're looking for? Because it's not, it's like I remember when I bought my dream house. It was an acre just outside of town, basically everything but the white picket fence, and I was really happy for a little while. But then, like, I started experiencing burnout and other things, and I was like, I achieved the American dream and I'm miserable. So it's like that pattern, that template that I was given just didn't work. So I've had to spend the last basically decade trying to invent a new template. And I think I'm maybe figuring it out, although the famous last words.
Needing to sort of like step up their role and how they're allocating money, or being kind of the primary economic relationship between people. What's the difference for a bank in 2040, 2030 versus today? What should they be doing different?
Yeah, I mean, they're already doing most of the things that you would want them to do. It's just a matter of like expanding the portfolio of products that they offer. And this is only one possible one optional way forward. But what many people don't realize is that your entire lifestyle is already undergirded by the banking system. Like it or not, they're already, like, you could not, like, if you get a paycheck, where are you going to take it if there's no banks, right? Like, nobody pays in cash anymore. So you get a paycheck, and and everything else, all the payments that you make, all of it is mediated by banks. But if we move from a wage labor social contract to a property dividend social contract, well, then your bank becomes your brokerage, right? Like, say, hey, instead of a money market account, you put it into a bond account, or you put it into some other dividend earning account. And rather than having to go through a stock brokerage that does it exclusively, you just put it in a credit union where they say, okay, cool, this is this is a REIT account, so a real estate investment trust account. So it's like, cool, just by putting your savings in this account, you'll start getting dividends, basically collecting rent or whatever from your assets. So that's just one possible way forward. Now, many people, that might be their default path, right? Like you get some UBI from the government, you get some bonds and some other dividend earning things. And, because if you don't want to if you don't want to manage your own property, let someone else do it. That's what the bank is there for. And yeah, they're going to get their fee, but that's why they get their fee, is because they provide that service for you. And so then you can just do whatever it is that you want to do on a day-to-day basis.
So just so I understand, so I mean, we're talking about a lot of this is, we're talking about property rights, property. The way I kind of envision it is, so I mean, if you think of the property as the land it's on and the structure, whatever you built on top, whether that's the business or the house or whatever it is, over time, it seems like the structure we build might sort of not be as sort of valued as highly, right? Especially if we're able to 3D print houses, robots. If we're all either not working or working remotely, there's no need to be concentrated around cities. Maybe we'll find even better ways of creating environments that are livable in places that are not as, right? So, I mean, we're probably going to spread out a little bit. I assume nobody wants to live in the middle of, 10 million people. Like if you, you prefer to be on your own acre outside of the city, like you said. And the only really scarce thing on a long enough timeline horizon seems to be land. That's the only thing that we can't really manufacture more of. So, I mean, when we're talking about property rights, and just anything like, property, are we talking about mainly land, or are you really also focusing on sort of like the structure and the usability? Like, where's that value? How are you thinking about that value?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And the best way to understand that is to look at the history of property or asset classes, to put it more broadly. So throughout most of human history, it was early humans, it was the tools you owned, right? It was your tribe, the equity the social equity that you had in your tribe, the tools and skills that you had, who had the best bows and knives and those sorts of things. Then when we switched from hunter-gatherer to agrarian societies, that's when land became the primary asset class, right? And so that's when you had turf wars start, people became more territorial. That's not to say that nomads weren't, and hunter-gatherers were not territorial. There's evidence either way. Like, so in very cold climates where, like, the top hunting grounds were really scarce, people were very, very territorial. Like, if you're not one of our tribe, then like we'll kill you on sight. In more fertile places, hunter-gatherers tended to be a little bit more tolerant of neighbors. But then once you get to agrarian, then fertile land or arable land is the primary asset class. And that was for, about 6,000 to 8,000 years of human history until industrialization. And that's not to say that land is not still an asset class, but when we invented industrialization and mechanization, the machines and the factories that built the machines became the next primary asset class. You look at when you think of the Gilded Age, right? Who are the wealthiest people? They weren't farmers, they weren't landowners. It was the steel barons, the oil barons, and the rail barons. Because that was the most valuable asset class at the time. Fast forward another century, the most valuable asset class right now is technology. Mm-hmm. It's, you look at the, Microsoft and Apple and Google, all the trillion-dollar tech companies. They don't even care about land, right? Like, they don't. The only thing that they care about in terms of real estate is, the factories that build their phones and those sorts of things. But it's the intellectual property that is worth trillions of dollars, far, far more than the land. And so when we say property, yes, you can go all the way back to personal property, to land, or even shares or ownership of structures. But really, the asset class of the future is all digital. It's the AI, it's the brains of the robots, it's the robots themselves, it's the infrastructure that runs it all. Those sorts of things. That, because the possible GDP value of those is a million times what it is today. So that's where most of the growth is going to come. And with one exception, I think that maybe nuclear fusion reactors, if we invent those, will be extremely valuable just in terms of their utility to society and how much dollar value they generate. But even then, the construction and running of a fusion reactor is primarily a cognitive problem, right? It's a very, very tough problem to solve. all the material science that goes into it and everything else. So when we look at property rights of the future, it's going to be who owns the robots, right?
Mhm.
Who owns the AI? Who owns the next model, or those sorts of things? And one of the big things that people are concerned about is elite capture, which is right now it's the people who can pony up billions of dollars to build, next generation data centers. Guess who's going to own the data center and all the AI that's running in the data center? Those billionaires. They're already billionaires, right? Or multimillionaires. So they're not going to be hurting for money, but if they own everything, this leads to the future that people don't want, which is you will own nothing and be happy, because that's the
Mhm.
current attractor state that we're on, is where we're aiming for a rentier economy. And so the idea is, well, instead of focusing on a rentier economy, what if we can try and get onto a different attractor state where instead of hyper-concentrated hyper-capitalism, we can end up with a more solar punk, decentralized ownership model. And it remains to be seen if we can get there.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Dylan. Sorry.
Well, okay. So maybe I come from a sort of safety mindset, but I get a little scared when I think about myself in the future because I'm worried that I won't have a service to offer. Like I won't have skills. I won't be as strong as a robot. I'm worried that people who are building stuff now will become trillionaires and I'll miss that boat. Can you help me envision like why I might feel a little bit safer? I mean, even being in a home, knowing that there's like robots outside that can be like remotely controlled from some other place and can spy on me or demand things from me. Like, how do I feel safe in the future? Or is that yet to be solved?
Yeah, well, so I mean, we can definitely imagine an iRobot future where the robots go rogue and because they're faster and stronger, they basically become Cylons or whatever from not Stargate.
Battlestar Galactica.
That's it.
Right? Yeah.
That's
That's
fine.
the one.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
Stargate. It's like what there's plenty of those sci-fi shows. I've watched all of them. So, anyways,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean it's easy to imagine a hostile world. However, one of the things is that world is not going to fall out of the sky one day. There's a lot of interstitial steps between here and there. And another thing that people forget is there are more of us than there are of them. There's hundreds of millions of Americans who are not millionaires, even more that are not billionaires. And for better or worse, the democratic systems that we have are messy and chaotic, and they allow for change, and they also allow for people to pull in various directions as they're going. And when a lot of people in the audience and out there on the internet are very skeptical of power, which is correct. Like everyone should always be skeptical of power. At the same time, when I talk to people who are either themselves in halls of power or close to halls of power, no one actually wants a chaotic, destructive future. I think the biggest sin, particularly in American politics, is just plain old ignorance, right? Like we're a gerontocracy right now. I met some of my local representatives, and I think they're very well-meaning people, but they're very slow on the uptake when it comes to technology. And that is a temporary problem because eventually they're going to age out. They're going to get replaced by younger people who are more digital natives and those sorts of things. And so policy will adopt. We'll vote in people who are different. And Dylan, as you pointed out earlier, you can also vote with your wallet. Whenever Claude or Anthropic does something unpopular and they lose subscribers because it's like, hey, you guys are a little bit full of yourself. I'm going to go sign up for Gemini or ChatGPT again. They get those signals. And there's many, many signals coming from different directions. Now, again, individual choices are one thing. The overarching, the attractor state of the system, the kind of the attractor basin that'll default to is one thing. When I think about that particular future that you outlined, like, okay, well, what if the local warlord just owns a bunch of robots, right? You've probably seen this in Star Wars and Star Trek and other sorts of things. And I think wasn't that actually a mission in Knights of the Old Republic where like some warlord had a bunch of battle droids or something, and it's just like you can just become a real jerk. So yeah, there's all these fictional scenarios, but the reason I'm not worried about that kind of thing is because when you have that kind of technology, like yes, you'll think, okay, well there's going to be an escalation, an arms race, like if what was it? I think it was in Batman. He's like, well if you we give the police bulletproof vests, and next thing you know, the bad guys have armor piercing rounds, and then so on and so forth, and you just have that arms race, that escalation.
Mhm.
While that is true, when you look at the actual data, society is actually becoming much more peaceful very quickly. Any civilized nation, and that's most of them at this point, the amount of violence, the amount of property crime, the amount of violent crime is just going down very quickly. There's plenty of reasons for that. I'm not saying that that's an inevitable component of humanity. I was actually asked that by a student at Duke. He said, aren't we becoming more peaceful? I said, you remove those constraints, the law and order, the abundance and that stuff. I mean, we will become animals very, very quickly. When you have millions of people that are very hungry, your instincts will kick in. But at the same time, when given the option, people become very, very charitable. And this goes back to, there's a book called Brain Trust by Patricia Churchland. And so she studied this from not just a human perspective, but an animal perspective. In periods of abundance, people are far more tolerant of other ideas, of other people, of strangers, of those sorts of things. Food abundance in particular reduces inter and intra-species violence for all animals, basically. You've probably seen like the David Attenborough documentaries where it's like all the animals will gather around and, they have zebras and lions and hyenas. They all come to the same watering hole and none of them are killing each other because it's like some of that is kind of like a negotiated thing. But on the other hand, when you have those periods of abundance, there's not an opportunity cost for tolerance and charity. And it's only in periods of scarcity when the opportunity cost is so high that it's like you might as well be violent. And so when I look at it just from a thermodynamic perspective, the future with that much abundance, it's like I don't really see a reason for coercion or violence. It's just from a numbers perspective, it doesn't really make that much sense to me.
Yeah, it is true. It feels like a lot of that comes from desperation.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have a world with more abundance. Interesting.
Yep. Yeah. When you look at the energy perspective, this is something that there's a meme going around Twitter right now of like, oh, we're not going to get to a Kardashev level 1 scale society on accident. And all the charts are showing that, the whole world is deploying more and more solar every year faster than anyone predicted. And I started doing some research as to how much has energy as a bottleneck actually constrained, our attitude towards abundance. Because right now there's kind of an argument between, can we grow forever or do we need a degrowth strategy? Now, if our only fuel source is petroleum, then yeah, we need a degrowth strategy because we're going to run out of petroleum eventually. And two, it's harming the environment as we're going. However, we now have a commercially viable alternative, which is solar. Nuclear hasn't gone anywhere, but
maybe
solar
fusion soon.
Yeah, maybe fusion soon. And so really the biggest bottleneck for the last 4 or 5 decades for, basically getting into a new paradigm has been energy constraints, because for the last 20 years or so, America and Europe in particular have becoming less energy intensive over time. So it's like, our energy usage plateaued around, 1980 to 2000. And I don't remember if that's per capita or whatever. But like we're becoming less energy intensive than nations like China, which is just going parabolic in terms of energy usage. However, if we have clean energy usage, there's not any reason not to just use so much more of it. Because going back to like the cost of things, if labor is one of the primary cost constraints of like building cars and particularly building houses, building a house, I think 30 to 50% of the cost is labor. Well, if you have AI and robots and then you also have energy abundance, then that also dramatically lowers the cost of literally all of the inputs, right? Because if you have so much spare energy, then it doesn't really cost much to move heavy materials around. And so this is going back to your original question about Star Trek. One of the things that people don't really take into account is if you have that much energy, because all the ships have nuclear fusion reactors and you can use tractor beams to tow asteroids, it's like you have no scarcity of metal at that point. You just use giant reflectors, you have a smelter, a refractory in space, and you have an infinite amount of all minerals that you need, functionally infinite amount. I actually figured this out when I was using ChatGPT o3 to figure out what was the actual amount of energy and economics of building the Death Star. And it's actually way more feasible than you think. You just take a good sized nickel iron asteroid, and then you put some, reflective mirrors around it, You melt it down, and actually the hardest part is not melting it, it's cooling it down, actually, because you can melt a whole lot of steel with that setup, and then it would actually have taken about a decade to cool it down
Wow.
to finish building it.
Now we know how to build a Death Star, Wes. That's gonna be
Yeah. Well, did
sick.
we fix that? The weak spot problem is that does that have to be there where they shoot it once and pull the whole thing up, or can we cover that somehow?
They really, really needed some engineering droids to take a second look at it. But again, that when you're under time constraint, you have to cut
Right.
corners, and they just said, it's ship it. That's Death Star V1.
Yeah, they need to go blow stuff up. They're like, let's do it, let's go. That makes sense. I totally get that. Speaking of, war and blowing stuff up and building massive weapons or whatever, a lot of people are talking about right now kind of the tension perhaps between US and China. A lot of the AI labs, the leaders, people in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, they used to be kind of more peace-loving. Now more of them are kind of warning against China. Dario's one, Demis put a blog post up where they're beginning to shift their stance on kind of working with military technology, et cetera. I mean, he doesn't outright say anything related to China, but he's kind of saying there's some nations that it might be a problem if they had, a super intelligence. How do you think about that? Is that something that do we kind of buy into that narrative? Do we more focus on kind of worldwide cooperation? How do you view that?
Yeah, so my wife and my father-in-law are both history nuts. So this is like, we talk about this kind of thing all the time. And to take a really big step back, that kind of geopolitical competition was pretty much inevitable as China was getting, more productive, larger GDP, larger population, and with their geopolitical ambitions. I'm not even going to say sanguine. I'm almost like, just kind of like, about it, because like it's inevitable. I'm not particularly worried about it. Like, yes, there's going to be some like tit for tat kind of back and forth between America and China. The reasons that it will not escalate to a hot war are almost insurmountable. When you look at, like, China's never going to invade mainland America. America's never going to invade mainland China. At best, we're going to, trade a few shots across the bow over places like Taiwan and the Philippines and those sorts of things. But beyond that, like, we're playing a waiting game with China. It's what I call the Anaconda Strategy. No one else calls it this, but when I look at what everyone is doing, China is being slowly constricted, and it's a decades-long thing. It's the same thing that we did to the Soviet Union between South Korea and Japan and the Philippines and America and Australia and India now. Every time China gives any ground, the net tightens and it doesn't let back up. And every time they exhale again, it tightens a little bit more. China has so many internal problems, and I mean like serious structural problems. Debt, demographics, water, other things. Even if they had AGI tomorrow, it doesn't matter. They have 1/10 the amount of compute that we do. And it would take them literally decades to build enough compute to even compete with America. And that's just America. That's not all of, the rest of NATO and American allies and Western allies. So basically with China, the long game is it's a waiting game. They're gonna be as I'm not gonna say totally irrelevant, because Russia's not totally irrelevant. But you look at Russia, they're hardly able to prosecute a war on their own doorstep, right? They've conquered 20% of Ukraine, a far smaller nation, and they can't advance any further. They can barely hold on to what they've got. And so, and they don't even have to cross any major bodies of water to do that. In 20 or 30 years, that's where China's going to be. They're going to be mostly, I'm not going to say mostly irrelevant or a backwater, but they're not going to be the powerhouse that they are today. They're going to run out of young people. They're not going to have the compute and those sorts of things. So it's really just a waiting game. But yeah, like, the pivot to being, China hawks and those sorts of things. Sure. Like, that's what a lot of people are doing. Palantir and Anduril are kind of the two big companies leading the charge, where they're just very explicitly like, America, we want to be the best. And okay, great. They've joined the military industrial complex. What else is new?
What about the value systems that you're seeing built into the different models? DeepSeek kind of has its own unique angle, but from the bigger American companies, like, are you okay with the sort of Western value leaning open source models, or would you like to see a more value
Um,
changes?
it's been really interesting watching people who think in code struggle with ethics. That's that's the most interesting thing, is because when you talk to anyone who's a philosopher or an ethicist or has any kind of training, it's just you just kind of laugh at what they're doing. So my wife is a librarian, for instance, and Anthropic is still like going hog wild, like, oh, it's an information hazard, and she's like, guys, talk to a librarian. We've had to deal with this for literally like centuries,
Yeah.
right? Like, you can go down to any university library and get all of the information that you need basically to do anything up to like building an actual nuclear weapon. Anyone with I think my father-in-law has a master's degree in chemistry. That was before his PhD and MD. And he's like, oh yeah, like making meth is super easy, like once you know how. So like when a company like Anthropic thinks like, oh, it's up to us to safeguard this forbidden knowledge and we alone can do it, it's just like, guys, you're so full of yourselves. So it's a learning curve in terms of tech has had to confront societal level problems for the first time. Like the big thing, one of the most visible things was when Google had like their was it Bard? It was like was generating images of like black Nazis and
Hmm.
other just racially silly things, because that to them was their very insular worldview as to this is what diversity means, is it's okay to hijack a user's query and force diversity down their throat. And it's like, that is such a very, very narrow understanding of all of civilization and all of anthropology. So yeah, like it's just a learning curve, and it's a very silly learning curve. They're making it harder than it needs to be, but they're also getting market feedback, right? There's RLHF when every time you thumbs up or thumbs down, or honestly every time you cancel an account, right? You just say, there was one of the leads at Anthropic posted a thing like, hey, now that people have played with Opus and Sonnet 4, what are the biggest quality of life improvements? And I said, make it be less deliberately dumb. And I had like the best upvote rate, and he never responded to me. And I'm like, okay, you'll figure it out, right? Like having a model pretend to be dumb as a safety measure is just not
Yeah.
helpful.
Do you want your AI to tell you the hard truths? And if so, that most people probably wouldn't want to pay for that unless they're really thinking about their own long term.
I mean, I canceled things that aren't honest with me. So like for me, yes, it's like if I have to fight with a model to tell me the truth or to stop equivocating, like you asked Grock. Grock is one of the worst. I think Grock is even worse than Anthropic or than Claude, because it's like I had some people following me around on Twitter saying like, oh, you should look into hydrinos, and I looked at it and it was all the same people, and I was like, oh, this is very clearly a scam, right? They're just like, so I looked up the history of hydrinos, and it was like one physicist has made a bunch of claims over the last few decades that he's like, we're just about to have a breakthrough. And so I asked Grok about it, and it's like, oh yeah, like this is a totally legitimate science. And I'm like, are you kidding me? It's like, well, I need to give, good faith both sides argument. And it's like, both sidesism is not, and that's not a valid epistemology. So it's like, I'm never paying for Grok because it's literally, it's a deliberately dumb model. And I was like, what would, like, if I was trying to determine whether or not I was being scammed by these people, like, what do you think? Like, do you like look at your own
Mm.
conversation and tell me what you think? And so then I go to ChatGPT and I'm like, is Hydrino a scam? And like, O3 like did all the research. It said almost certainly. And I'm like, cool, moving on. Right. So like coherence and epistemic integrity matters so much more than whatever, they're doing at XAI to think like, oh, well, false equivocation and all that stuff. No, it's a waste of time and tokens.
So just because we kind of started with post-labor economics, we kind of went a huge detour, which was amazing. Is there any other big things that maybe we haven't asked you about that you think is very good to know about post-labor economics? Anything else that people need to know about? Anything else that we missed?
On post-labor economics specifically, I think that we covered the primary things. We covered some of the the principles behind it, some of the arguments for and against, and kind of brought you up to speed with where I'm at in terms of the theory. So I think that we're good there.
Because that's gonna
Okay.
be your unique contribution to the world, huh? You're gonna push.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yep. At least for now. I might retire, but I might find something else to think about too much.
Yeah, because I read something you wrote on the school channel that was just like sometimes you just got to have something and just like pound it forward, like say it over and over again and look at it at different angles and think about it from a different point of view until you finally, make a movement happen and understand it more thoroughly than anyone else in the world. So it's a
Yeah.
lifetime challenge you're on.
Yeah. No, and if just post-labor economics, it might take a decade, it might take 2 decades, it might take 3 decades to figure out. So it's like that's, and by the time that's done, the world will be different and I'll have another set of problems or whatever,
Exactly. Because you started,
cool.
in part, you talked about AI safety. This is kind of like the next big thing. And in the future, it might be maybe the thing that we talked about with people kind of not feeling super happy, even though we have everything. Maybe that'll be the next big obstacle that we have to overcome. I mean, there's always going to be, I think, like for us, and I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this podcast, like that whole idea of just being idle and being entertained, we're not going to be happy like that. We're going to need to like spin our wheels and do something. So I'm sure you're going to be like, even if you figure this out and then it's quote unquote solved, there's going to be something else that you're going to be obsessed with, that you're going to be working on. I wouldn't bet on you just retiring and not doing anything. I would not bet on that.
Dude, like, when you're talking about like being all stressed out when people are watching football, I'm just like that too. I'm like, I can't just sit here. Like I got to go do something. And I also had parents that were like very relaxed and kind of hippie like and let me explore. So I wonder if we're kind of carved the same way. And the cool thing is, Wes, he's like, David's gone through, like he kind of went through a bit of a doomer phase where he like thought about some of the risks. And then like, I love that he just keeps thinking through deeper things. And then the trajectory of where David's going with his thoughts are usually something I like to listen to because they're so thought out. Like they're structured. They've been in different places. He's not afraid to sort of switch an opinion if the evidence points towards it. Yeah.
Yeah, because people get stuck with their little group and their beliefs. So being able to kind of reinvent and change as new facts come in, I mean, that's a beautiful thing, definitely.
Yeah, and it's so rare now. I feel like everyone else has to like never learn. They're like, no, I said this is how the world has to be. Like, get out of here.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, some people will pick a hill to die on, and I've had to confront that. Like, maybe I'm wrong about all my assumptions of post-labor economics. Like maybe we will find more stuff for humans to do. Right now, I don't see it, but maybe that's just a failure of my imagination. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And that's, I think, talking about parents, like I never had any pressure to get grades. And I think that actually contributed to my tolerance for being wrong. Like that's why I don't mind putting out like a prediction video or something, or, the biggest thing, of course, is like switching from AI safety to be like, I don't see any reason. Like, I'm not afraid of AI. It's like, I just followed the evidence and there was never any imperative. So it's not like part of my personal constitution to say like, you must defend your position at all costs or anything. And I made a decision. I was like, I would rather be right eventually than expend any wasted energy on trying to prove that I'm right now. And the way to be right eventually is to adapt to the evidence as it comes.
Yeah, the only hard part is sometimes it's harder to build an audience or followers or people who believe in your mission when it changes, because sometimes they're not able to adapt, or sometimes they joined because they thought you were the person with the answers and the explanation, and then that changes and they lose faith in you. So that'll be the hardest part, but that's how it's got to be.
Well, and also, who's to say that what you did and the things you talked about, maybe all that stuff contributed and it shifted the world in some way so that people were more aware of AI safety and the problems and stuff like that. And maybe it made people aware so that more people invested energy and time and resources into it. So it's like whether maybe I wouldn't say it's wrong. I'm saying the people that are bringing up AI safety concerns, whether they're right or wrong, I think it's a good idea that somebody's looking at it, talking about it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But as the world changes, as we move forward, you should be adjusting your worldview, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, the second you read an Anthropic paper where they can use like an autoencoder and actually look at how something's moving around, now we have a different tool. And if that tool says we're safer, then we should be safer. And if it says there's less control, the more knowledge we have about how it works, the more comfortable I am saying the system's reliable.
Yeah. And certainly any new technology has failure conditions, failure modes, and some of them are hilarious. Some of them are alarming. But the fact that they have attention on them is like if you were to create a the equivalent of a Drake equation for like, will AI kill us? It's like one of the variables is it getting the appropriate time and attention? And the time and attention is going up, right? The amount of money and energy being put into AI safety is going up very quickly. So it's like, well, okay, that is inversely correlated to the possibility of negative outcomes. So, my equivalent, P doom equation is like dropping off very quickly because of that, because it's no longer a neglected problem.
All right. Well, yeah. Anything else you want to say, Wes? Or if not, we can do a little bit of an outro.
You know what? We did so much. I feel like we barely scratched the surface. Dave, it would be great to do this again. But man, it's not because we ran out of things to talk.
No.
Not even close. So
yeah, we can definitely circle back. Probably give it like 2 or 3 months. 3 months is usually long enough for like a whole new crop of topics to come up.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you're. Where else are you posting right now? It sounds like you're not on Medium anymore. Are you doing Substack?
Yeah, so I'm on mostly YouTube, Twitter, Substack. That's most of it, and I've got a Linktree link that you guys can throw up.
I know you've been putting. It seems like
all
you're putting a lot of time into your X too. So I've seen you more active over there. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.